Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. It's human enough to spend a moment before casting and trying to imagine what the fish is thinking, even if one of its eggs is as big as its brain, and even if, when you swim underwater, it's hard to imagine that a fish has anything to think about. Still, I could never be talked into believing that all a fish knows is hunger and fear. I've tried to feel nothing but hunger and fear and don't see how a fish could ever grow to 6 inches if that were all it ever felt. In fact, I go so far sometimes as to imagine that the fish thinks pretty thoughts. Before I made my cast, I imagined the fish with the black back lying cool in the carbonated water full of bubbles from the waterfalls. He was looking downriver and watching the foam with food in it, backing upstream like a floating cafeteria coming to wait on its customers. He probably was imagining that the speckled foam was eggnog with nutmeg sprinkled on it, and, when the whites of eggs separated and he saw what was on shore, he probably said to himself, "What a lucky son of a gun I am that this guy, not his brother, is about to fish this hole." Well, that's a passage from Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It. It's one of the reasons why you ought to read the book and not just watch the movie. It's full of wonderful gems like that. And no, we're not going to talk about eggnog recipes, and I think you should drink eggnog all times of year, and actually include egg whites in your cocktails for that matter. But we're going to talk about something that Norman there observes about fish, or at least he personifies fish as thinking in the way that we do. But just because fish are not us, and I've said that plenty of times, and I'll say it over and over again, doesn't mean that they don't have certain activities and actions that you can perceive. And because these actions and activities, this body language, if you will, is relatively consistent and noticeable, it's a skill to observe these things that is worth honing as an angler. So the question is, can you decipher fish body language? Can you decipher fish body language? Well, first of all, why would you want to do this? If you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking, I was hoping to listen to something that would help me catch more fish now. Well, I believe that we're going to talk about for the next 15 minutes actually will help you catch more fish. And it's something that you're probably implicitly doing already, which we'll talk about here in a second. But there's something to be said for observing fish behavior. At the bare minimum, you do this when you notice that there are fish that are feeding. You see the white mouth underwater. You see the fish going up to the surface to rise. You see a fish swimming away from me, and you know to yourself, I can cast a nymph to that first fish, a dry fly to the second fish, and do what I might. That third fish that's swimming away, I'm probably not going to have a chance to go after it. So that is why it's important to understand what's happening with fish. And there's a whole lot more to it. There's more nuance. We're going to go well beyond, if it opens its mouth, it's feeding. If it goes to the top, it's eating off the surface. And if it swims away, it's scared. There's a lot more to it than that. And in fact, there is a lot more to it, such that if you Google fish body language, you're going to get page after page after page on the internet from aquarium folk who have a vested interest in figuring out what their fish are doing and why they are doing it. There's actually a great amount of attention, apparently, that's paid in the aquarium community to how their fish are feeling, if their fish are happy, if their fish are stressed, what their fish are up to based on their body language. And so, again, I'm not saying that you're going to figure out if you should cast a hare's ear versus a nymph based upon what that fish is doing with its adipose fin. However, I think that there are certainly some things that you can glean from observing fish and their behavior. So, like I said, a lot of this is intuitive. A lot of this is something that you pick up over time. So all this will serve to offer you is a little bit of a leg up, or it might give you a different perspective if you've been thinking about this, but maybe not at the forefront of your mind. And I can't blame you. That's what you do when you deal with kind of the minutia of angling like we do here in Casting Across. So again, this is something that you will pick up with experience. But as per usual, it might not necessarily be the kind of thing that you could sit down and articulate to somebody that is fishing for the first time with you, or if you were quizzed on it, which I don't think the fish and game folks are going to do to you. But that's what we're going to look at. And more than that, once you know to look for things, you'll start to look for things. Isn't that always the case? When you are told to pay attention for something, then you will start to look for it. Now, how to do this? Is this something where you should go stamping out into the next trout stream that you are fishing in and spend more time paying attention to how the fish are acting than fishing? Absolutely not. But a few podcasts ago, I talked a lot about using fish. And I talked about bluegill as uh, object lessons and case studies. And I genuinely believe that bluegill and sunfish and all the other kinds of fish that are almost always willing to play ball are a great test ground for this whole endeavor. I actually did this recently. Last week, I took my boys fishing just to a local pond, and the first one cast a lure in, and nothing happened. And the lure was too big. The lure was not hooked on right. The worm was all mangled up on the hook, this rubber worm. Well, another son cast out a little tiny grub that was swimming through the water in a very natural way. I mean, there's nothing natural that chartreuse. However, the way the thing was moving in the water was natural. And the fish began to respond very actively. And then son number 3 comes along and casts a spinner, and big fish came up and started attacking it. So it was a great, object lesson for the boys to say, okay, what happened with that first one? Nothing. What happened with the second one? There's a lot of interest. What happened with the third one? Well, the fish just came and attacked it. And we talked about what the difference in all 3 were and why that might have been. Why the fish were completely unimpressed by the giant worm that was rigged poorly. Why the fish were interested in the grub that was being fished in a very natural way. And while some fish were attacking, but not necessarily sticking around that spinner. And how each taught us something about how those fish reacted. And I actually, encouraged the son that was using the grub to say, listen, what you are doing is you're getting their attention. That means you only have something small to do. You don't need to change your lure necessarily. There's small things you can do to get the fish to pursue that. And for the boy that was using the spinner, I said, you're in the exact same boat. The fish are coming aggressive, but no fish is committing. So maybe it's too big of a spinner. Maybe you need to slow down your retrieve. Maybe you need to add a little bit of a pause or a jerk or cast out further to where there might be some bigger fish that are willing to commit to that lure. So bluegill can serve as a wonderful test ground for this. You can really see them well. You can have them up close and personal. And honestly, this is where I honed this craft on bluegill and then on spring creek trout, where you can see them very, very well. And part of this means paying attention to fish when you are not fishing for them. That takes a lot of discipline, and that takes a lot of energy and effort to say, you know what, I'm not going to fish today. I'm just going to go watch fish. And the things that you observe, the things that you see when you're not fishing are completely different than when you are worried about your rod, your line, its trajectory behind you and in front of you, your leader, your fly, all of those things. You pick up on so much more. So it's definitely a worthwhile endeavor if you have the time. So all that to say, what are some of the things we look for when we watch for the body language of trout? So the first thing I like to look at is just where that fish is holding in the current. And I'll go through a few different parts of the fish anatomy and things to look for. When you pay attention to a fish, you want to look at its head, specifically its mouth, its fins, especially its pectoral fins, the fins that it uses primarily for steering itself, for a lack of a better term, and then its tail, what it uses primarily to propel itself. Now, if a fish is in moving water, it's using these things not necessarily to move in the water, but to stay in the water. And so you've probably seen a fish that gets ready to bite, who's intrigued by what you're drifting to it, and it will stop finning in the current. It will actually kind of go not necessarily limp, but it will lessen the movement of its pectoral fins, and it will lessen the movement of its tail. That immediately precedes it either A, just drifting back and opening its mouth and taking that food, or if it has to change its trajectory, then it kicks in a little bit harder. So it goes from a slow and steady, maintaining its place in the current and the feeding lane to a falling back, and then, if necessary, into an aggressive posture to pursue that. Now, this is important to know. This is generally how it goes. This is usually what a fish does. That pectoral fin movement and that tail fin movement usually slow down when it is observing a fly coming past. However, if you don't get that aggressive amping up of pectoral fin and tail movement, then you know that fish has maybe seen your fly, but it doesn't. There's something about it that's just not right, especially if you're able to do this more than once, and it continues to observe and observe. Now, it may be the third time's a charm, and if you're like me, there's times where you fish to the 35th time and see if that's the charm. But these are things to pay attention to. If that fly goes past that fish and nothing changes, it doesn't move a muscle, then that may be well, it could mean a few things. One, it means the fish is not interested. Secondly, it means that you just need to change your fly. Thirdly, it may mean that where you perceive your fly is, it actually isn't. It's too deep, it's too shallow, or your drift is bad. Now, there's fish that will not be turned off by those things. They'll just completely ignore it as if it's not a big deal. You have to remember there's countless things floating by, kind of like McLean's stuff on the sprinkles on the eggnog analogy. But these are things to pay attention to. Now, real quick, you are going to have to be in a position where you can see this. And for a lot of situations where it's not gin clear water, where it's not a crystal clear surface, smooth, glassy surface, then you are going to be seeing these things in abstraction. And this also takes some practice to be able to determine where the fins of the pectoral fins and the tail of the fish are. You may see a shadow, and you're just getting abstractions of this if the water is broken, or the fish is holding deep, or the fish has its camouflage and the surface of the water and the bottom of the stream to its color advantage. But you're able to pick up subtleties. Now, it's great if you're fishing in a situation where you can see that fish clearly, and every once in a while we find ourselves in a position where we can see that fish totally clearly. But these are things to pay attention to. Now, something else that I think is worth mentioning when it comes to this is when you see a small variation of this, where that fish goes from a consistent holding pattern in that feeding lane to kind of flicking something. It may jerk its head or twist its body to the side as your fly goes past. If it does that and then it goes back to its normal feeding pattern, then that is an indication that you probably did something to trigger that response. It may be good, it may be bad, but you do know that it isn't neutral. You've at least gotten that fish's attention. Being able to throw that fly back into that situation again is not a bad idea. Now, I will say, and again, there's countless variables that are unknowable because who knows what's going on in the mind of that fish. But if that is the continued response and that fish does not attack, my preference is not to continue that fourth or fifth or sixth presentation. It's to either rest that fish or to try a new fly, because if it's acting in some sort of agitated manner, then it hasn't turned on that fly to feed yet, then that might put that fish down. And of course, putting a fish down is something that can absolutely be determined by body language as well. This is when that fish drops back on the current. This is when that fish sinks down just deeper, because both of those activities, we often think of that fish swimming away, going behind a rock, going to the pool below, going to the pool above, something like that. But if that fish feels like it's safe and that you're not really that much of a threat, it'll drop back in the pool or it'll drop down lower in the water column. And those things are indications that this fish is turning off. Now, depending on where you're fishing, this fish may be done for the day, or this could be just a kind of a heads up that you need to step away, go fish a different pool, and return to this fish because it's slightly perturbed, but isn't necessarily turned off for the rest of the day. So that's something to consider. Now, in highly pressured waters, that fish just might go still. It might stop feeding. And you can see this with some of these popular catch and release waters where a fish is actively feeding and then you make a pass at it and it has one of these times where there's a variation to its pectoral fin movement and its tail fin movement, and you see it stop actively feeding. You no longer see the white of its mouth. You no longer see it darting to the left or the right. All it's doing is holding its position in its feeding lane, no longer going after, certainly not after your fly, but after the naturals as well. And this may be an indication that you've turned this fish off. It is not scared of you and it is brave enough to stay in that spot, but there's been enough of a variation in its activity and its body language that you can almost be guaranteed that fish is not worth going after. And this can do a few things. One, it can learn, you can learn something about how fish behave. But secondly, you're not going to waste your time on a fish that has changed its body language, and this will save you a lot of frustration. I know that for many years, and probably still do this today out of being stubborn. There's a fish that'll drop down in the water column, and I'll continue to fish to it thinking, okay, I just changed its position. But more often than not, this is an indication that that fish has been spooked, it has been turned off. It is not going to go after my fly. However, there is an agitation that is beneficial, and there are some fish that get this way, especially the fish that is kind of the biggest toad in the puddle, as it were, the fish that is going to get defensive and aggressive and territorial about other things coming into its pool or into its area. And this is the time where that fish may drop back, but if it does so, and it doesn't do so simply by gently changing the cadence of its tail and pectoral fins, but it does so by zipping back to the back of the pool and then maybe zipping back up and then back again to the back and then back into a holding position, but maybe now moving with a little bit more oomph behind it. That is a indication that that fish has an aggressive posture. Now, it could be it's a completely crazy fish. I've come across plenty of examples of that where the fish just act really weird and wacky and there's no way to determine what's necessarily happening. But more often than not, when the fish goes into that mode, maybe it's going after other fish, it's bumping them, which, again, fish don't have hands and fish don't have words. So they're going to bump into them, they're going to kind of rush them. Those are fish that have an aggressive kind of attitude about them, where that streamer or maybe that big fly, and again, a streamer doesn't necessarily have to be stripped in front of that fish. It could be that you bounce that leech and that fish has some sort of aggressive demeanor about it, where it isn't necessarily protecting eggs or a bed. It could be in the middle of summer. It could be post-spawn. It could even be pre-spawn. But it's a fish, and so it only has so many things it can think about over the course of its life. And so it sees that thing that's bouncing along the bottom that looks very aggressive, that looks like it could be a threat to it or what it is wired into its brain to defend, and it will go after that fly. So if you see that agitation, it playing that out to other fish, to your fly, or to just the pool in general, then that is an indication that you might want to go after that fish. Now, of course, if you are fishing on the edge and the temperature may be a little bit warm, the water temperature and the air temperature, or maybe the water conditions are low, that very same behavior could be indicative of a stressed fish. Because if that fish is stressed by environmental factors, it's going to react in the same way as if it's stressed by a foreign object in the pool. And the thing is, they're probably both going to strike, but if it's happening under conditions of that dissolved oxygen being lower, which you're probably not going to be able to tell by the things you carry on your person, but because the temperature is warmer, then that's the fish that you want to stay away from. Take that as nature's way of saying, leave this fish alone. It's not having a good day, and it's probably not the fish that you want to go after. So in a current, that's a handful of things to pay attention to. Its tail, its pectoral fins, the variations that go into it. Does that fish sink in the current? Does it drop back in the pool? Is there a stillness to it after you've made some presentations? Does it get aggressive? Is it agitated? Now, I'd be remiss. No, hold on a second. Let me back up. If there's any questions you have about that, again, I am not a fish behavior expert, but I've given some great resources. Certainly, I think the book In the Ring of the Rise by Vince Marinero, it specifically deals with fish behavior when it comes to rising and interpreting that, which I'll mention here in a second. But that's a great resource. There's a number of other ones. Joe Humphreys has a good book on it, and there's a lot of great resources out there. But a lot of it does come to just kind of trial and error and watching fish, and not just thinking that it ate or it didn't eat. It almost ate or got spooked. There's definitely more nuance within those categories, and unfortunately, there's a lot of Venn diagrams where there's kind of muddy middles, but that is generally the case with most things. But like I said, Rising. I want to talk about rising just in the last few minutes. This could be its own podcast, but I think it definitely factors into this same fish body language conversation. If you see its mouth breaking the surface, that means it's rising to real dry flies. If you see its nose breaking the surface, that means it's a more gentle rise to a real floating dry fly. If you see its head come up, just the back of its head. Now, again, a lot of this is just takes discernment. How to tell the difference between let's say a rainbow trout, generally speaking, a relatively rounded, snubby nose. The difference between a rainbow trout's nose and the top of a rainbow trout's head. So if you were to kind of look at it head on with its face to your right and its eyeball directly above it, 12 o'clock, its mouth 3 o'clock, is it that space between 12 and is it closer to that 3 o'clock position, or is it closer to that 12 o'clock position? And if it's closer to that 12 o'clock position that's coming up, it may be taking a merger, something in that subsurface. And oftentimes when that happens, you have the benefit also of seeing the dorsal fin come up and maybe even the tail come up. And these are often splashier rises. Now, it could be that it's a very small fish, and so to make that motion to get it up in the water, it's a very, very splashy rise. But a lot of times, big fish will expose the top of their head as well as their back and maybe even their tail when they're taking these emerging flies. One, because they're pursuing something that's moving. And two, because to get in that best position to feed on that without necessarily breaching the surface completely, then their back is going to be up in that surface tension, creating a disturbance. So there's a lot more to be said. I mean, an infinite amount more to be said about rise forms, but I think it was worth just at least mentioning ever so briefly. So with all that said, does this sound super abstract? Does this sound even a little bit silly? Well, it might be, but I think this is something that if you stop and you think about it, these sorts of things truly add to the way that you perceive fish and the way that you approach them. And it can truly save you time. You're not fishing to a fish that you've put down hour after hour. And I know people have done that, and I know I've done that. But if you're able to discern body language, then you can not only know when to change your fly, when to move on, but maybe when to take a break, rest a fish, and come back to it and have a better preparation in the presentation that second time around. Again, let me know if you have questions. Matthew@castingacross.com. This week on the website, Monday's article is called Fishing the Post-Dusk Rise. Fishing the Post-Dusk Rise. Really, this is just some tips and tricks for when you are fishing as it is getting dark. Not fishing the evening rise, but legitimately as it is getting dark until in those moments right before it gets dark, because there's usually a flurry of activity there. You might have a great evening rise, and you might have action under the moon, but there is oftentimes a magic hour that you've hopefully experienced in between those moments, but it's relatively short. So I talk about some things that I like to do to maximize that 45 minutes on the water, cut down on messing with equipment, cut down on messing with what could be the overwhelming situation of lots and lots of fish rising. So that was a good article. Got a lot of folks reading it. Definitely check that one out. Fishing the Post-Dusk Rise. And then Wednesday's article was a little bit unfortunate. It's called The Genuine Risk of Fly Fishing. Last week's podcast episode was called Don't Die Fly Fishing. And that was recorded on the same week as Father's Day, at the end of the week. Unbeknownst to me, on Father's Day, up in Maine, not too far from me, a gentleman who actually only lives the next town over from me in New Hampshire passed away because he was fishing on the river. He slipped, he went under, his waders filled, and he was unable to come to the surface, and rescue was not able to be there in time. Incredibly unfortunate and sad story. He was fishing with his adult son, and I genuinely say this, that my prayers are with them, with that family, and this situation. But on one hand, I don't want to. Certainly, I'm not capitalizing off of this, but it's just a sobering reminder that safety steps ought to be taken. That this is not a risk-free activity. And as I say in this article, it's not that had he been wearing a wading belt, everything would have been fine, but it's just a reminder that that's the kind of thing that mitigates risk. And so this article, I mentioned this, and then I just knock out 8 or 9 bullet points just as a reminder to do what you can to be safe. for yourself, certainly, but also for your loved ones. So once again, I do express my condolences to that family, and who knows, Lord willing, run across somebody from that family, and since we basically live in the same town, and we'll be able to share that with them. This week's recommendation on the podcast is a lens color. A lens color. So I am going to recommend the Sunrise Silver Mirror lenses from Costa Del Mar. So I've said before many times on the podcast and on the website that Costa Del Mar glass lenses, 580G glass lenses, are my preferred lenses for fishing. I've been fishing with them for I don't know how many years, over 10 now, and I have a handful of different lens colors because I feel like if I'm going to have a handful of different fly rods, I might as well be able to see in those varied conditions as well. So I have things for very, very bright conditions, I have things for variable conditions, and I have lenses for low light conditions. And the Sunrise Silver Mirror lenses accomplish that. I always carry them with me when I'm on a trip in case it gets very overcast. But then if I want to fish first thing in the morning, or if I want to fish into that late evening post-dusk rise, like I mentioned in that article, for a few reasons. One, I want to see what's going on around me. I want eye protection. But then also I get the benefits of a polarized lens without making things darker. If anything, that Sunrise Silver Mirror really pops when you are fishing in those low light conditions. It makes light really, really amplify. So I'm a big fan, and I would absolutely recommend you pick a pair up. What I would recommend doing is if you have a pair of Costas already, whatever that pair is, and you love them, just get that same frame with the Sunrise Silver Mirror, and you're golden. That's what I did with the Fantails years ago, and so I do not regret it. I will put a link to Costa, one of their pages. I've yet to find it, whether it's about those glasses, that lens, or whether about just a particular frame. You can find out if you go to this podcast show notes over at castingacross.com. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app and then rate the podcast over in iTunes and Spotify. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.